Good morning. Welcome to INSA's Coffee and Conversation with Zachary Tyson Brown. I now like to introduce INSA Vice President for Policy, Larry Hanauer.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for INSA's Coffee and Conversation virtual speaker series. This morning, we're pleased to host one of our community's most innovative thinkers. But before we get started, let me run through a few housekeeping items. We hope to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. We're pleased to welcome members of the press to the call today. So this is a reminder that this program is on the record. Now, about our speaker. Zachery Tyson Brown is the founder of Consilient Strategies, a different kind of strategic advisory consultancy. He's also a security fellow at the Truman National Security Project, a nationwide membership of diverse leaders committed to shaping and advocating for tough, smart national security solutions. A U.S. Army veteran, his career in the IC includes service as a contractor, a civil servant, and a consultant. Zach's recent articles in Foreign Policy, Defense One, and other outlets have generated a great deal of discussion about the state of our national security apparatus and the reforms that are needed to make it more effective. We're happy that he's agreed to share his ideas with INSA this morning. Welcome, Zach.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation to spend some time with you this morning.
Great. We appreciate that you're willing to share your time. So let's start with some big picture issues about national security strategy. So you write that the United States needs to reconceptualize its national security strategy and overhaul its governance systems to reflect the fact that the world is changing and that other global powers are challenging U.S. hegemony. So what changes to U.S. strategy are needed to adapt to changes in the world?
Well, that's a great opening question. I see we're starting right off with the big picture view. Well, I think the next president, whether President Trump is reelected or if Vice President Biden gets elected, whatever administration comes to power over the next 4 years, we're at sort of a pivotal time in world history, specifically in American history. And I think that really we need to get our own house in order before we can compete effectively on a global stage that is much different than what it's been, particularly since the end of the Cold War, but especially during the Cold War. I think that we've, for too long, sort of disregarded the foundations of national power, whether it's public infrastructure, moving goods and material around, public education. Obviously, public health care is a huge concern right now during the ongoing pandemic, worldwide crisis, and really investing in modern digital infrastructure for the 21st century, where those foundations of national power and global power, as I mentioned, that is a healthy, very well educated, agile national population that can move around and contribute to the global economy in ways that advantage American interests. And I think the next step would be sort of a recalibration of our position in the world vis-a-vis other great powers, whether you think of Russia as a great power, certainly China as a great power. We need to come to terms with the fact that the Cold War has been over for a long time. United States prestige and position is not perhaps what it once was, and we need to be able to have a compelling message to bring along allies and partners with us to know where we want to go and then bring them with us as we go there. So for the first time at least in my adult lifetime, I just turned 40 this week. So my entire career has been spent in sort of the post 9/11 era. But for the first time, we have real competing global powers. Like China has a completely different model of world structure and society that they want to sell other countries of the world to come on board with. And for many people, that's a compelling vision. So as the United States, we need to reconceptualize what our vision is. And everyone knows what we're against. We're against an authoritarian China coming to power. But what are we for? And having that message and being able to sell it to the rest of the world for everyone's prosperity and security, I think is very important for the coming era that we're in.
Yeah, but how exactly can the U.S. reclaim a global leadership role? I mean, we seem to take, particularly in recent years, we seem to be taking a more of a short-term transactional view to a lot of national security challenges. So how can we take a longer-term strategic view that enables us to bring allies along and bring the U.S. back into a leadership position?
Well, I'm certainly not the first guy to think about this. I mean, someone I respect very greatly is Greg Treverton, former NIC chairperson. And he's argued for many years that we need sort of a long-term strategic body that is thinking about what American interests in the world should be. Which originally, that's what CIA and the National Security Council was kind of meant to do in the beginning. And we've, as you mentioned, we've sort of been bogged down by these short-term responsive issues, particularly since 9/11 and the war on terrorism. I think we really need to come to terms as a people with, what we think we want to do in the world. And it's not just, in the threat of terrorism or, thwart China's rise to power or prevent Russia from interfering in our elections or whatever, short-term issue it might be. We need a vision of, what is the future of American progress and human progress for this planet. We live in a globalized society that's not going to change. We're not going to go backwards and, marring any sort of catastrophic outbreak of nuclear war or something. We have to come to terms with the world that we live in, I think. And that world we live in is, one in which our older 20th century apparatuses are not sufficient to the challenges that we face today. And I think more and more people are recognizing that and sort of coming to the recognition that, we have these outdated processes, and that's what I write about a lot, that we need to rethink and modernize to be more fit for the fluid challenges that we face going.
Okay, well, that's a good transition from talking about what we want to achieve to how we should go about achieving it. And so I want to get to an idea that you've written about. You refer to it as a national security operating system. So you wrote in Foreign Policy that the U.S. has a Cold War era operating system that's riddled with redundancies and inefficiencies, and that operates, I think, as you wrote, at the speed of the rotary telephone, and that to update our OS, we need a 21st century National Security Act that would make our national security architecture more adaptable, resilient, and transparent. So what kind of changes need to be made to upgrade our national security OS to achieve those three characteristics? And what are the principal barriers to these changes?
Well, the principal barriers, for the one, well, let me reconceptualize that. So if you look at the way our system is supposed to work, and the way it was designed at the outset was it resembles an early 20th century multi-divisional hierarchy, kind of the sort of structure that was pioneered by firms like General Motors back in the 1920s. And that was, this evolved sort of in parallel to scientific management theories that came around at the turn of the 20th century. And when we put these structures into place, American government was really modernized with the National Security Act of 1947. That was kind of the, flagpole. This is how we're going to manage our government and manage the affairs of the Cold War. And it worked very well for, at least 30, 40, even 50 years. But, as I mentioned, as I used the analogy, it was built for an era of rotary phones and carbon copies where, diplomats would send back cables. We still use that terminology today.
Yeah.
It took days for messages to go back and forth. And we had this sort of decision-making body at the top in the form of the National Security Council that was originally supposed to deliberate and inform the president, and then rational decisions could be made, and then those orders could be flowed back down through the hierarchy so the apparatus of government could carry out those orders. But we have too many stoppages in that system now, and it's not grown up like barnacles over the decades, where you have competing interest groups in different departments, even within departments. DoD is a great example. All the different agencies of the fourth estate that kind of compete against one another for budgetary money. The services all compete for their priorities, and then the other segments of the government that are much more important today in a digital era that you may not think of as national security apparatus, but they are. Public health obviously is hugely important right now. They tend to lose out in the budgetary fight because there's so many stoppages in this hierarchy. What I think we need to do is have a more resilient and adaptable system where, one thing that constrains us, and I'm sorry for going all over the place, but that's just how my brain works. One of the stoppages that we face is, the budgetary process. We can't plan, we can't respond to short-term crises that arise because we have to, factor things into the budget at least a year or two at a time. And in a world that's unpredictable, that is increasingly complex with emergent crises that sort of arise out of nowhere, that's just not a setup for success. So I think to be able to respond to emergent needs, you have to have that adaptability. And then the other thing I talk about is resilience. Resilience is the degree of shock that a system can tolerate while maintaining its structure. So these hierarchies that we've built are incredibly brittle because whenever a senior leader leaves an organization, there's always kind of a flux period where they don't know who the news person is going to be. They have to find a new person to appoint and get confirmed by Congress. We have all these sort of workarounds right now with acting appointees, and that has all kinds of problems that comes of its own. We need systems that are better able to absorb the shock of these challenges that arise out of nowhere, and then also adaptively respond with resources and ideas to mitigate crises as they arise, and then just as quickly reallocate resources when those crises subside. Because one of the really most frustrating issues we face in the national security sector is there are programs that have existed for decades that are impossible to close down because there's always that one office or one sector that is still arguing for its how critical it is. So it's hard to get that funding out of the budget line whenever it's not really useful anymore.
Right. Once you create a program, it's hard to eliminate it. But you raise a good point about the budget process. So how can the government be more adaptable when, as you point out, agencies request their budgets 2 years in advance, and then it has to move through a whole approval process in the executive branch and then go through Congress. So how can agencies adapt when they don't know what their budgets are going to be like for another 2 years or until really the fiscal year is upon them?
Well, I mean, right now it's practically impossible. I mean, so I think that you're seeing a lot of agencies work on sort of workarounds. DoD particularly is, and that's obviously I come from DoD, that's my background, so I'm more familiar with that. But Congress has wisely granted DoD authorities to do some outside the box sort of funding for innovative programs and startups and things like that with different. But that example is an example of our failure, I think, because we're having to work outside the system we designed by giving agencies authorities to hire people faster, by giving them authorities to fund innovative bits of technology but may not have gone through the entire process. That is a symbol that's a sign that we need to change the structure. So I think until we have a fundamental restructuring of how we do congressional oversight in the budgetary process, I mean, don't get me wrong, the budget that's in the Constitution. The Congress has to have oversight over the executive branch and how the executive branch is spending money. But the way we do it now is so slowed down that we need to figure out a way to modernize that and have more of a, maybe more of a venture capitalist sort of model of agencies are allowed to invest money in segments, like an initial tranche of money and then a second tranche of money that comes after they've shown that they've had success or failure or whatever the case may be. We need to modernize that structure for the 21st century. That's
It's interesting, or just a few minutes ago, you mentioned the role of the National Security Council. That's always a debate that comes up. It often changes from administration to administration. What role do you think the National Security Council should play in coordinating these activities? Should it be more of a policymaking, active policymaking body, or should it be more of a coordinating body for a decentralized apparatus?
Well, if you look at, Amy Zachery has a really good book called Flawed by Design, and she dives into how the national security came about in the first place with the National Security Act of 1947 and what President Truman thought about it at the time when he enacted that. If you look at the problem with that whole argument is these structures that we now think of today as enshrined in stone. I mean, they were argued about vociferously, by our forebears. The DoD had the Army and the Navy had its own interest in wanting to prevent the creation of a unified Department of Defense. The Joint Chiefs, there was argument over how that should be structured. The National Security Council was originally meant to be, like you said, a coordinating body, pass papers around and kind of make it, a convenient place for the president to be able to access information. But it turned into, like I wrote in one of my articles, more of a board of directors. And different presidents use it in different ways, and that's certainly their prerogative. And the language of the law is flexible enough to allow them to do that, and they should be able to. But that whole model, I think, of having that comes back to the model of a multi-divisional hierarchy and having a board of directors at the top. If you look at the most agile, innovative companies in the private sector today, they still have a board of directors, but they tend to push authority to make decisions down to lower levels, where much closer to where the action is. I mean, you can't have creativity and agility and innovation by having major programs come up to a central brain that is by nature just too slow to respond to situations as they develop. So I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I do know that we need some smart people to come together and think about what a new model might look like.
Okay. It's funny, you also mentioned both General Motors, sort of the origin for this national security structure, and then you started talking about more agile modern companies. So you've also written, though, that as part of this OS update that the community needs, that the community should adopt a new business plan. What kind of business model, whether it's based on the GM model or an agile startup kind of model, what new business model would you recommend that fit today's challenges? And it seems like these business models might address things like talent management, security practices, and other sort of core business practices that you need to put in place so that the organization or the community can pursue its core missions.
Right. So let's deconflate the idea of business model from organizational structure. So when I talk about business model, I mean, I talk a lot about the value proposition. What is the value proposition of the intelligence community? And, a lot of people say, and a lot of people told me in response to this article, and they're right, the intelligence community is not a business. They're not trying to sell something. But if you look at it as a metaphor, the intelligence community is selling the insights that it creates to its customers, who was, primarily the president, first customer, and on down to everyone throughout the system. So in the past, the value proposition was, we know things that you don't. We can collect information from behind the Iron Curtain. Excuse me. We can find out, the network this terrorist leader has, and help you to be able to help the military to be able to conduct a strike or to capture him or kill him or whatever the case may be. But that's less true today than it was in the past, because there's always been alternate sources of information for presidents. I mean, FDR had a group of businessmen he relied on to give him information before the creation of the IC officially. But today, everybody from the president on down, all down through military commanders, policy makers in Congress, senior executives in the DoD and elsewhere, they can all sort of garner information from anywhere in the world all the time, from practically anywhere they are on their phone or their device. And it's also custom tailored to their preferences. So they can get any news source, and it's more or less all the same information, but it's packaged in ways that is more appealing or less appealing based on their biases and their political beliefs. So I think in order to sustain relevance in the 21st century, the IC needs to sort of shift its value proposition from the idea of, we have information you don't, which is still true. I mean, the IC is always going to be able to collect niche information that nobody else has, but it's got to be to something more valuable, because it's more scarce, which I think is, which again, coming back to Greg Treverton and others, I like the sense-making model of being able to tell a story about the world and help policymakers to understand it, to navigate it more easily.
But even if the IC can demonstrate its value proposition to policymakers and customers, basically, it's hard for the IC to demonstrate its value proposition to the American public, given that so much of what it does is classified and out of view. So how can the community demonstrate to the public and to the members of Congress who have to appropriate its budgets that this roughly $80 billion a year investment actually pays off and should continue to be supported?
I mean, that is the key question, and it's something I don't have a perfect answer for. But what I would say is, we need to recognize that rapid communication across the entire network that's where real value is created today. And I do think the IC needs to spend more time focusing on the public. And there are certain things, like there's a public's daily brief that the ODNI puts out that is sort of like kind of like an early bird news article style of thing. But I think we need to, and you have seen the NIC put out, publicly released judgments on things like election interference, stuff like that. Those immediately became, political football. So that's a very difficult thing for the IC to do. But in this realm where, there is no longer a front line of warfare in this sort of information age. I mean, we have, just the other day, NCSC came out and said, hey, look, the Russians, the Chinese, Iranians, everybody's trying to influence our elections. The attack plane, to use a cyber term, is really everywhere today. And the enemy is in contact with us. I mean, not enemy, the adversary, we're not in war, but the adversary, people trying to influence the public, they're in our country. We're all connected in one way or another. So, and by the way, the public is a key target of that in sort of the modern sort of great power competition information warfare we're in. So, the IC is traditionally focused on decision makers at the top of that hierarchy I talked about. But even if those decision makers make the best possible decision, it's still ignoring the fact that, the public is being barraged by manipulated information on a daily basis. And that's only going to get worse as we get further 21st century with things like, deep fakes and other technologies coming online.
Yeah. So on that point, let me take an audience question that addresses that. And let me take this opportunity to remind you that if you do have questions, please submit them through the box on the right-hand side of your screen. But building on the point you just raised about disinformation, Joseph Boot asks, how does the environment of disinformation and misinformation affect the new business model that the IC requires?
I think it makes it much more, even more important than it is if you took that out. I think so. My idea of a new business model, value proposition for the IC, and would be, like I said, the sense making and storytelling aspect, which is, looking at all the information that's out there and trying to put it in context, make sense of it, help decision makers at every level of the government, not just the senior executives or the president, but because, as I mentioned, we need to come to we need to have a structure that is more devolved power and let people closer to action to be able to respond more rapidly. So we need to focus on them just as much as we focus on the people at the top. I think helping those leaders to make decisions by putting information in the context and helping them to understand the world, because they don't have time to read, all the different stuff that's out there or to become experts on every particular issue. So if you have intelligence officers that are helping them to understand the world and make sense of it, that can help them to make better decisions. Now, that raises questions of, do we want intelligence officers to be more close to policymakers because it raises issues of politicization and possible threats? Right. But I think we're at a point now where, and I've always been of the Gatesian or the activist school of intelligence theory. I think that it's, relevance is more important than perfect, perfect independence. But, I think that we can do it. I think our intelligence officers are professional enough and trained enough. Lawyers are unbiased in their application of the law towards their clients. Doctors give bad news to their patients all the time with their bedside manner. I think the intelligence officers and lots of agencies across the IC are just as professional as that. And if we ever want to move towards a true professionalized model of intelligence workforce, we call it the right trusted workforce, and they are. We have brilliant patriots working every day who are largely, by and large, I have never seen a case of politicization in my career, 20 years working in defense intelligence industry and in DOD at some of the highest levels. And if you look at examples like, the Iraq War and WMD, for instance, a lot of that happened at higher levels where, senior officers and policymakers were, in an impossible position to provide information to the president. And a lot of that happened within the administration, like the Bush administration particularly wanted to push that narrative. At the lower levels where analysts were working, CIA did a really good job of pointing out the pros and cons of the case against Iraq for WMD. So if you go back and look at that, politicization is a thing that it often gets a bad case in the press, but I know that scholars like Stephen Marin at JMU, they've done a lot of great work on, how real is politicization, and it turns out it's not as much of a threat as it's often made out to be in the press.
But isn't it hard for intelligence professionals to remain objective when they get close to policymakers and the policymakers do kind of, put their thumb on the scale to favor an outcome that they prefer or a worldview that they might have? I remember in my time on the House Intelligence Committee, I saw some relatively junior analysts give a briefing, probably GS-12s or 13s, and they had members of Congress asking questions like, well, so isn't what you're saying such and such? And these GS-12s had to essentially stand up to members of Congress and say, well, no, sir, that's not what I'm saying. And that's hard, right? So how do analysts stay objective in an environment where they're working closely with policymakers and may find themselves subject to pressure?
So I'm not saying it's not hard. Obviously, that's difficult. I think it takes a different. You have to be more careful about the type of analysts that you're hiring and training to do this. We need to. We've had a problem in the United States where, particularly if you look at after 9/11, CIA had been hollowed out in the 90s. There was a huge hiring surge after 9/11 because we knew we were going to need a lot more analysts and out there. And I came up in that era. So, the bars were lowered to bring people on, and perhaps training is just now getting back to where it should be, where it was perhaps during the Cold War. I don't know if that's true or not, but hopefully we are. I think we need a much more strict look at the kind of officers we promote. It has to be a certain type of person who has the, the mental acuity and the integrity to be able to stand up to people in power. And that's a core value we have in the IC is, speak truth to power. It's harder for junior analysts to do that, but junior analysts shouldn't be put in that position without being equipped with, the tools necessary to resist influence. So like I said, coming back around to the model of, doctors or lawyers or any other professional organization, we need to have, professional review and training that, equips intelligence, primarily analysts, that's, who's going to do most of this stuff, with the tools they need to stand up to authority that's trying to pressure them, but, obviously in a respectful way, and let them know that, well, no, sir, that's not what I'm saying, or no, ma'am, what this actually indicates is X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
But that's a professionalization issue.
I want to move on to some questions about intelligence community collection, which you've written a lot about. But before we do that, let me sort of take as a transition question, a question we've gotten submitted from Glenn Gerstel, former NSA General Counsel, who writes, given that the IC is so focused on uncovering secrets, how would you structure an open source mission? Would you create a new open source organization? And if so, where? Or would you enhance the role of open source within current organizations?
So I hear a lot of retired or former very senior IC officers talk about the need for an open source agency. I think that's absolutely the wrong way to go. I'm a little anti-orthodox in that regard. I think that we have to realize that open source is not I don't see it as a specific discipline. There are obviously tools and methodologies that are specific to open source collection, particularly online social media data mining and things like that. Not saying there's not specific tools, but we have to think of open source, in my view, as just the way the world is. It's something we have to adapt to for every other int we use. I mean, Humint is a lot of it is primarily open source now. A lot of communications intelligence is open source now. Everything travels through digits, through ones and zeros, and all this is more or less accessible online. I mean, there's gates and and doors you have to open to get some of it, but a lot of it's in the gray media. But open source is a way of life. It's not to make a Zen-like comment. It's not a specific thing. So I'm against making any new agencies, because that's just adding another box on that hierarchy that is constraining and slowing us down. So if you had another organization that's going to be competing for budgets and resources, I think that it might give us some incremental improvements in the short term, but I don't think it's a long-term solution at all.
Okay.
I think instead we should. I'm sorry for blowing. I know we don't have that much time left, but I do think we need to have every analyst, officer, collection officer, everyone should be open source literate and realize that's the world we live in.
Well, so given that open source information, as you say, is sort of everywhere, it makes it hard to figure out really what the intelligence community's niche is. I mean, if everyone has access to tons of data, whether it's cyber threat intelligence or geospatial images, so what is the IC's niche if everyone has access to all these different kinds of data, and if the intelligence community no longer has a monopoly on things like satellite images, which were once available only to the government? So what's the value of the IC there if everyone else in the open source world is also using similar information, potentially for similar purposes, and including providing it to policymakers who make extensive use of open source data?
That's exactly the point I'm trying to make in my argument. What is the niche of the IC? I think because all that stuff you said is true, and it's going to be more true going forward. There's going to be, I mean, just today, even now, private sector companies are doing space-based collection, just like only the IC could do 50 years ago.
Right.
Right now, the private sector is leading edge in open source collection, social media data mining, all the sort of stuff that is at the sort of bleeding edge of the collection that's going on today. I think that's a lethal threat to the IC's current value model. And that's the point I try to make. I think and that's why we need to think about re-envisioning it. Now, personally, as an analyst, I think that my analytic background is sort of my value proposition. I think that training officers that are able to help decision makers to frame problems and to think about their thinking about them, sort of almost like a facilitator to help them think through the decision-making process. I think we need to have analysts that help policymakers go through decision-making processes, frame their problems, and help them think about their worldviews and to challenge their own assumptions and biases. So that all comes in with the sense-making model that I'm a fan of. And it comes back to Greg Treverton's point about intelligence is really, at the end of the day, about storytelling. We need to be better storytellers and help people to put all this messy information in the world in context.
Right, and you write that gets harder because the intelligence community basically is swimming in information, much of it, in fact, from open source. You wrote that the IC has fallen into what you call a collection trap, that it collects as much as possible, which then makes it harder to focus on the information that's needed so that analysts can tell that story. So how can analysts or the community as a whole make better sense of these massive data holdings, or maybe even collect information in a more targeted manner in the first place so the community isn't so overwhelmed?
So, it's interesting. I got that idea of the collector's trap from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. It comes back to they call it, people are more familiar with the Red Queen effect. And it was taken from evolutionary biologists, kind of snagged onto this, but it comes from the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. And, if you remember, she tells Alice that, in Wonderland, you have to run twice as fast just to stay in the same place. So that's the collector's trap. We're in a world of this burgeoning data sphere of all this information that's, doubling every 2 years or whatever it was last time I checked.
Yeah.
And we can't collect it all. So no matter how many systems we build, no matter how many, AI systems come online to help us with it, we're never going to be able to close that gap between the amount of stuff that's out there and the amount of stuff we're able to collect.
Yeah.
And then even the stuff we can collect, there's only a subset of that can be processed and then analyzed. Processed, let alone analyzed. Now, analyzed is probably a very tiny sliver of the overall. So I think that's a losing game. So that's kind of my point of the collector's trap, is we fall in this trap where we think that the next technological revolution is going to allow us to collect everything in the world, but I don't think it will. So that's just another point in my book of why we need to reconceptualize the value proposition. So perhaps we don't need to collect everything. Perhaps we need to have, like you mentioned, more tailored, targeted selection of the things we care about most. Another problem that came out of the 90s and really existed into well into this century is, everything became a priority for the IC. So if you look at, after the end of the Cold War, the IC was sort of scrambling around looking for a new mission. And it came to be, things like environmental intelligence, proliferation of nuclear weapons. Like the IC got hit for not being able to predict Indian nuclear tests, and I think it was George Tenet at the time said, "Well, I didn't know I was supposed to be looking for that. That wasn't on our priority list." And and then it was added on year after year. And then after 9/11, obviously terrorism became the number one thing. So then, the IC became. It was now expected that the IC could predict terrorist attacks anywhere in the world and find, terrorist cells. So everything became something we were supposed to do. And obviously, big picture strategic thinking sort of fell to the wayside, and we've kind of woken up and realized that in the last few years.
Yeah.
So I do think we need to reconceptualize what is the priority of the intelligence community. I think the priority of the intelligence community should be helping national and not only national, but even mid and lower tier leaders in the national security apparatus to help better understand the world and make sense of it. And that sounds like a wishy-washy thing, but I think it's all connected to the idea of grand strategy we come back to, which is, what is America's purpose in the world? What is it we want to achieve? And does this align with getting us there? So it may not be, a specific, I'm going to tell you where these 5 guys in this terrorist organization are at any given time of the day. To me, that's all tactical level things.
Right.
Very, it may be necessary to protect American life and livelihood and around the world, obviously, not denigrating that mission at all. But that's not the stuff that's going to get us, ahead in the great power competition that we're.
Let me get to some audience questions. So we managed to touch on those in the time we have left. You mentioned just a few moments ago the role of technology potentially in sifting through all the massive amounts of data that we're collecting. So we have a question from Randy Fort from Raytheon, former Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. And he asks, which exponential technology trend is the most important for the IC to confront and embrace?
Probably artificial intelligence. I mean, I know that's kind of a stock answer, but I really do think that, and I've read and written. I've read a lot, and I've written a little bit. Hope to write more about it soon. We're at the dawn of sort of a revolutionary change in human existence on this planet, I think. And that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. We're going to have for the first time systems that are going to be able to dramatically reduce the amount of time we have to spend on any given problem. But they're also going to be, in large sense, autonomous. So that is something that is new under the sun, to borrow an old phrase. So I think that, as AIs proliferate, combined with, to use another one, combined with things like 5G, and then, 6G will be coming down the pipe soon after that, we're going to have there's a great book I read recently, I forget the name of it, but it basically talks about how we used to talk about being on the internet, but really going forward, we're going to be in the internet, because everything is online, everything will have a sensor, everything will be connected in some way or another to some sort of AI that's, collecting data, aggregating data, getting trends. And that's both a scary and a promising future, because it's going to change the way we work, change the way we live, and obviously it'll change the way we conduct intelligence. So, the IC has its augmenting intelligence with machines, and that's good. We're feeding this, and we're putting out, values for how we want to work with AI. But I don't think we've come to terms yet with just what a revolutionary sort of change this is going to be. So that comes to the question of, what is the role of the human analyst? I think that, AIs are always going to be better than us at remembering information, recalling it quickly, and then displaying it in a way that's visually appealing to a human. Analysts are never going to beat them doing that. But what we have, our superpower as humans, is, we can be creative, and we can match information together in a way that an AI can't. At least not yet, not until, perhaps general AI comes online, if that ever does. But, we should be able to use the time-saving measures that AIs can afford us to give human analysts more time to craft those stories and tell them the policymakers that I've kind of indicated.
That's it's interesting. That dynamic is one that INSA's looked into quite a bit. We've had a series of events, I think about a half dozen or so over the last year, we called the Human Machine Team, and it looked into different aspects of the collaboration between analysts and artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies to essentially look at who's augmenting whom. Are the analysts augmenting the technology, or is the technology augmenting the analysts? So if anyone's interested in looking into that dynamic more, post it on INSA's website, or a series of videos from those events over the last year or so that get into that issue. And it's really, really interesting dynamic. Let me get to one other question that gets a little bit to your point about telling a story and sort of making sure the intelligence community has the people and the expertise needed to tell a comprehensive story. So Kristen Kennedy asks, as we think about realigning to emerging threats, can you talk a bit about how we can use professionals in other fields like cyber, energy, and epidemiology, either to work within the IC or to share knowledge and analysis across these disciplines with the IC? So I guess that gets to the point of, if you're telling a story about national security threats, you can't just have the typical economic analyst or geopolitical analyst. You need people who understand cyber tools and public health threats and the role of energy or environmental issues or whatnot, so that you can tell a really comprehensive story. So how do we bring in those sort of non-traditional intelligence perspectives into the intelligence community's storytelling?
Well, I mean, I think that's right. That's exactly where we need to be going. I don't think it's necessarily bringing them in, because a lot of those experts aren't going to want to come work for the government, or commit to a life of life in the poor pay of a civil servant, and all the constraints that come along with that. I do think that it's vital that the intelligence community finds ways, and there are some ways that exist, finds ways and grows those ways to bring in outside expertise, to talk more routinely and share more information more broadly with academia, with private sector entities that are sort of on the forefront of many of these challenges. I mean, I've spoken to private sector organizations before, and one thing I tell them is that they are on the front lines of great power competition. If you look at, I mean, obviously you look at American actions recently towards Chinese companies like Tencent or apps like TikTok, things like that. If you agree, or whether you agree or not, that is the sort of the forefront of this economic, I don't want to call it a Cold War, but this competition that we're in with another rising great power. So companies are out there every day competing, and whether or not they like it, they're painted as an American company, their headquarters is in America, they're a US entity. We need to equip them with the intelligence information they need to be savvy actors in this sort of global competition. That also means we need to take information back from them and learn their best practices on things like, obviously cyber threats. I mean, there's tons of companies out there that are doing great work in the cyber, risk intelligence domain that, frankly, the IC could benefit from. And that, obviously with medical intelligence, we need experts from epidemiology and things like that. So that comes back to the question of how we organize, how we do security classification and training.
Yep.
If everything we do is classified, it's much harder for us to bring those outside experts in, which is why I'm an advocate for doing a lot more work in the public sector out in the open to where we can have more collaboration.
Yeah. Let me take, we have a couple of minutes left. Let me take a question that gets to your points about agility. This is from Roy Hartsfield, and he asks, what one or two moves can we as managers take within our organizations to become more agile within the existing system today, particularly during a pandemic?
I mean, that's a tough one. I love the question because I think honestly, it comes down, as a manager, you need to empower and trust your people and give them sort of the leeway to take action because they know what needs to be done. You don't need to bring in, expensive outside consultants or anything to tell you how to restructure or how to manage your people. I mean, usually your people know what to do. It's just they're afraid to do it because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. And I think we need more managers and leaders who are willing to go to bat for their people and to remove any institutional roadblocks or hurdles they may face, to give them top cover when they want to do something that's outside the box, to help them, hey, if you want to go to a seminar, if it's not an IC sponsored event, absolutely you should go. You should dial in and listen to it. We're too cautious today of letting our employees, I'm not in the IC anymore, but of letting, I was a junior analyst at one point. I left it as a GS13. We're too cautious today of letting our analysts get out and coordinate and work with other people, just like your last question, that are working in agencies or working in the schoolhouse and academia or in private sector, and sharing that information is going to be vital for us to succeed.
Yep. So one last question in the time we have left. You're talking about a lot of materials that you've been consulting and reading, and you've been reviewing a wide range of studies and commentaries on intelligence and good governance, everything from, you've mentioned Greg Treverton and others, but you've cited Aristotle and you've cited BuzzFeed. So Betsy Meso asks, what's on your reading list that INSA members might want to pick up?
Ooh, so many. I mean, there's so many books back there. I could do an hour just on that. I think so. Right now, I'm reading. Right now, I'm switching back and forth between two giant biographies. I'm reading one about Ernest Hemingway, which is really, it's like the latest one that kind of explores his all of his psychological issues. And then the other one I'm reading is this huge 800-page book about Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century political philosopher. And the reason I like that is because there are other, so I recently read one about Machiavelli. And these are people who lived in times that are not unlike our own, where old institutions are sort of showing their age and crumbling before them, and new ones hadn't been invented yet. So if you look at Machiavelli, for instance, he lived at the end of the Middle Ages. The early modern period was just beginning, and he advocated for his native Republic of Florence to adopt a more modern sort of state structure in its government. Really revolutionary stuff. And then Montaigne in 16th century France, it was in the midst of the religious wars of France. They looked like they were going to go on forever. They'd already gone on for 20 or 30 years by the time he wrote these books. And he was talking about the need to modernize and reform government. So I'm drawn to those sorts of historical analogies to our own time, and I think we can take those lessons and apply it into what's going on. Now that sounds really wishy-washy. Let me give you like some stuff that's probably more applicable to people today. There's a great book I just started called, I'm only about a chapter in, but it's called A World Without Work, and it's by Richard Susskind, and it's a follow-up to a book he wrote with his brother a couple years ago called The Future of the Professions. And this book is really good. It talks about all the ways that new technologies are sort of changing the professions and how we think about going to work in an office place for 8 hours. Obviously, that's a huge, relevant right now with COVID. So all these things are changing with things coming online like AI and distributed technologies. So we're in a period where we get to kind of redesign how we think of work and professions and the intelligence community helps. There's three. I hope at least one of them might be helpful to people.
Yeah, no, those are great. My own reading list is a little bit more concrete, I guess, and current. I recently picked up a book called Moscow Rules by Tony Mendez and John Mendez about how the CIA managed successful operations, human operations, in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which was also really interesting. So,
well, if you want one on that line, just last month I finished Active Measures, Thomas Rid.
Yeah.
History of information operations, both from the Soviet Union and the United States all throughout the Cold War, and it's really enlightening.
And very, very relevant today. And in fact, we're going to have a panel at our Intelligence and National Security Summit on disinformation. We're not going to include Dr. Ridd as a speaker, but we'll be talking about a lot of the same issues that he's addressing in this disinformation panel at the summit. With that, Zach, thanks very much for your candid insights. And for all of you watching online, thank you for joining us. So if you'd like to get in touch with Zach, feel free to connect with him on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you can continue the dialogue. So looking ahead with INSA events, tomorrow we'll host a 2-hour webinar on ensuring supply chain integrity in 5G and other critical systems. We didn't really talk about 5G in great detail today, but we'll talk about it in extensive detail tomorrow. On August 26th, we'll host the Senate Intelligence Committee's Republican and Democratic budget directors for a view from the Hill, insights into congressional priorities for the IC. And on September 10th, we'll hold our inaugural leadership luncheon honoring Lieutenant General Bob Ashley, the outgoing director of DIA. And then finally, as I hinted, on September 16, 17, and 18, we'll hold our annual Intelligence and National Security Summit, which we host in partnership with AFCEA. Details can be found at intelsummit.org. So please go there and check out the agenda and register when you can. When the webinar ends, a short survey will pop up on your screen. Please take a few moments to complete it and let us know how we did. So this concludes today's program. Zach, thanks again. And to everyone out there, stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful day.